Thanks for having me today. And it feels, I think I'm better speaking to a live audience because I'm looking at myself. And it's funny because in looking at myself, I'm trying to see if I can find my grandmother in my features, and I can't. And it's because I look more like my mother, I think. Although as I get older, I look more and more like my father. But it's my grandmother I'm going to be talking about today. What I know of my grandma's story, where it started, was, and by the way, this all came out in fits and spurts from different family members. I never heard it from my grandmother. But if any of you know anything about the history of that part of the world, it's 1947. The British, in exchange for leaving India, for leaving the colony that they created and handing over political power to the newly elected Democratic Party in India, they, as a parting gift, if you would, decided to side politically with somebody who decided that India had to be partitioned. So India was going to be partitioned into India and Pakistan was going to be a wholly pure Muslim country. So all the Indians from Pakistan had to move to India, all the Hindus, I should say, and all the Muslims from India had to move to Pakistan. That exchange was the most bloody period in India's history. The slaughter that occurred, the bloodshed, the stories. If I begin to get into details, I probably won't sleep for a couple of nights. But suffice it to say that the various experiences my grandmother had during this journey caused her to go pretty silent by the time I remember knowing her. So to paint a picture, here's my grandmother, heavily pregnant, with her 13th child, and ranging from, I guess, babe in arms, really like about a 1-year-old, all the way up to her oldest child, which was my father, who was 14 years old. He was considered the head of the family at that time, and he was helping his pregnant mother and very young siblings make this partition, make this crossing into a different country, completely filled with bloodshed. And what I do know is 4 of those children did not make it. Nobody talks about them. I don't know their names. I just know that they did not make it through that partition. And the experiences that they had, those experiences seemed to turn my father into a very cruel, very violent man. And it had the opposite effect on my grandmother. It made her go silent and withdraw into herself. Now, her feelings and the way she felt about her grandchildren was never in question because, even though she didn't talk a lot, she was just that solid presence. And by the way, this is India, so we all lived in the same house. So my grandmother was a daily presence in my life. And she was the constant. She was there when I came home from school. And my mother wasn't. She was working and earning a living for us, keeping a roof over our heads. But my grandma, toothless and wearing a white sari because that's what widows did in India. You did not wear color or ornaments or jewelry or anything. So she would wear a white sari, she was toothless, and she had very thinning hair, white hair that she would scrape back into a low little bun. And her biggest voice, and it was not vocal, of course, she didn't speak much, like I said, but her voice was in her acts of service. So let me backtrack just a little bit. My father comes from a farming family. So he's a farmer. I am built like a farmer's daughter, and which caused my mother great consternation because I was not like the, very dainty person with long fingernails and very dainty hands. I've just never been that person. My mother comes from that kind of family, and so you know, in her mind, she's always been disowning me for that and other reasons. But um, naturally, because they were farmers, they had livestock, and they had cows and buffaloes in the farm in Pakistan that, by the way, they had to leave. That's what happened is on both sides of the border, they all had to leave their properties, their homes, and everything behind. They could only bring with them what they could carry on their person. So they couldn't bring the livestock, of course. And so when they moved to Madras, India, which is it's on the southern coast, naturally, like rational people would do, my father brought home a buffalo. Now, this is not the buffalo of the American prairie that you're thinking of. It is, however, still a buffalo. A buffalo and her calf lived on a very narrow patio in our ground floor apartment, like behind our ground floor apartment. And also, fun fact, this apartment only had 2 bedrooms, and the only way to bring Lakshmi, the buffalo and her calf, out for a walk was through our bedroom, the kids' bedroom. So every day, twice a day, the buffalo would make rounds through our bedroom. So yeah, that was a fun little fact of my childhood. Anyway, so every single day we all took turns milking the buffalo, and we had liters and liters and liters of milk. And even though our family was a little large, we could not possibly consume all that milk. What we did do with it was we made yogurt, we churned butter, we used the full fat cream in our cooking, and of course we drank a lot of milk and buttermilk. So the way you churn buttermilk is you have the full fat milk, and it has to have a lot of ice in it. It has to be cold, and it's a clay pot. And even as a child, I that was one of my chores, is I would sit on the floor with the soles of my feet holding this clay pot, and it had a cover on top with a wooden churn with grooves in it, and there was a rope through the grooves, and you sat back and you pulled at the rope, which caused the churn to turn. And because the milk was cold, that's how the butter formed. The most delicious butter I've ever had in my life. I can still almost taste it. But what was left was the buttermilk, full of electrolytes, very, very nourishing, very cooling to the body. And what my grandma did every single day, it did not matter if it was blisteringly hot, which in South India was almost always blisteringly hot, 2 seasons, very hot and monsoon. That's it, take your pick. So my grandma would sit outside in her white cane chair with her white sari, and she'd have like one part of it over her head to protect her, provide some very meager protection, I guess, from the sun. But she would sit over there with her clay pot full of cold buttermilk, and she would just wait, because what she was trying to do very silently, quietly, but I think with a very big voice, she would feed all the day laborers who passed by her, whether they were vegetable sellers, whether they were pushing carts of fabric, whether they were making deliveries, whether they were construction workers. Because again, I don't know if you know this, but with day laborers, they don't start the day off with money. They didn't have money in the bank. They didn't have a bank. They worked that day, and whatever money they made, on the way home, they stopped and bought a fistful of lentils and a fistful of rice and took that back to their wives, who cooked the meal. And that's what the family ate that day, which means that the breadwinner, so to speak, the rice winner, during the day had no means of feeding themselves. There was no food, no nourishment. And of course, since my grandma knew this, she sat out there and she provided nourishment, and in the form of buttermilk. Anybody could come get some. She never put a limit on who could have how much. And she did this day in and day out. That's not something she set out to teach me, but I think from everything I remember about my grandmother, that is what I imbibed. The other thing that really impacted me about my grandmother is that when I was 6 years old and my parents were not home that day, she I guess I'd had enough of, I don't know whether it was the voices in her head or the images she must have kept seeing, but she poured kerosene over herself and lit herself on fire in front of me and died. So this was the person I loved the most in the world at that time. And she died in front of me. And I did not know what to do with that. And I think I just sort of absorbed it. I didn't think about it. It's something that has stayed with me, but I don't think about. I don't know what a psychologist or psychiatrist would say about that, but that's what I did. However, as I am now older, I'm realizing that my grandma comes out in different ways. One is that I carry on her tradition of nourishing. I feed people because I feel compelled to, not just because I like to, but it's a deep need within me to nourish people, to feed them. And that's a tradition I carry on from my grandmother. I also, however, decided to break tradition, which is that unlike my grandmother, I will wear color. I will fling color on my walls. I will wear bright lipstick. I will be loud, very, very loud. I talk a lot. And I am not afraid of being the loudest voice in the room. I don't care what anybody thinks about me. But I will not let my grandmother's story be forgotten anymore. I will not let her, I'm here because she made that trek. And for whatever it's worth, I'm here. I'm here, and I will not let my grandmother be forgotten. And that's my story.